She left her grandparents' house. She was 17, and she was never seen again. Her father said she ran away. Phone data said she didn't. Cameras showed movements that were never mentioned, and the story started to fall apart. Her name was Bernadette Walker. Bernadette Walker was 17 years old, born on May 18, 2003. She was a photography student, drawn to images and moments, to the idea that meaning could be found in light, framing, and patience. Friends described her as creative, thoughtful, and observant, someone who noticed what others missed, who processed the world visually before speaking about it. She had plans, not dramatic ones, not distant ones, real reachable plans, coursework to finish, projects to submit, future still flexible, still forming. Bernadette split her time between family homes. Like many teenagers navigating complicated adult relationships around them, she learned early how to adapt, how to move between spaces, how to keep going even when circumstances were not simple. She stayed connected to her grandparents. Their home was familiar, predictable, a place associated with routine rather than risk. That mattered, because safety is often defined by familiarity, by places we stop questioning. In the days leading up to July 18th, Bernadette's life did not appear to be unraveling. There were no reports of her planning to run away, no messages suggesting fear, no preparations for disappearance. She did not pack belongings. She did not say goodbye. She was expected to be where she was, at her grandparents' house, with family, within reach. When people last saw her there, nothing stood out. No argument overheard, no visible distress, no dramatic moment that demanded attention. That absence of alarm would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of her case. Because Bernadette did not vanish from chaos, she vanished from normality. As the hours passed and contact was not made, concern began quietly. At first, it was uncertainty, a missed message, a delay that felt unusual but explainable. Then time stretched, silence settled, and slowly the realization took shape. Bernadette Walker had not left behind a trail. She had left behind a gap. And whatever happened next did not announce itself loudly. It unfolded behind closed doors, in spaces defined by trust, proximity, and authority. By the time questions were asked, the answers were already slipping out of reach. And the last place Bernadette was known to be safe would soon become the center of a case built not on discovery, but on absence. Because when someone disappears without warning, the most important clues are often not what is found, but what is missing. When investigators began reconstructing Bernadette Walker's final days, they focused not on strangers or distant possibilities, but on proximity, on access, on routine, on who was close enough to shape events without attracting immediate attention. Bernadette's family structure was layered, but it was not chaotic. She maintained contact with relatives on both sides of her family. She moved between homes as needed, navigating adult dynamics with the quiet adaptability many teenagers develop when stability is shared rather than fixed. Nothing about her movements suggested flight. Nothing suggested secrecy. Nothing suggested preparation to leave. What mattered most to investigators was this: Bernadette did not disappear from a public space. She did not vanish while traveling. She did not fail to return from a planned outing. She was last seen inside a family home. That fact alone narrowed the scope of the investigation. Attention turned toward her father, Scott Walker. At first, there was no public declaration of suspicion, no immediate accusation. Scott Walker was not a stranger. He was Bernadette's father, someone with unquestioned access, unquestioned familiarity, and unquestioned presence in her life. In the earliest hours after Bernadette was reported missing, Scott Walker presented himself as a concerned parent. He spoke to police. He offered explanations. He described a narrative in which Bernadette had left voluntarily, upset after an argument, choosing to walk away. At face value, the account was plausible. Teenagers leave homes. Arguments happen. Silence at first does not always mean harm. But investigators are trained to sit with plausibility and test it. As police began examining timelines, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Not dramatic contradictions, not obvious falsehoods, but small points that failed to align cleanly with what could be verified. Mobile phone data became one of the earliest pressure points. Bernadette's phone activity did not match the movements described. Signals placed her device in locations that conflicted with the narrative of her leaving on foot. Periods of inactivity appeared sooner than expected. And critically, the phone stopped generating data far earlier than would be typical for a teenager who had chosen to leave voluntarily. Then there was the issue of transport. Scott Walker stated he had driven Bernadette away from the house following an argument and dropped her off near a local park. It was a detail meant to explain both her absence and the lack of witnesses at the home. But vehicle data told a different story. CCTV footage from surrounding areas did not corroborate the described route. Traffic cameras recorded movements that did not align with the stated drop-off location. The timing between recorded vehicle sightings and phone activity created gaps that could not be reconciled through explanation alone. Each discrepancy on its own might have been dismissed. Together they formed a pattern. Investigators also noted what didn't happen. Bernadette did not contact friends. She did not reach out to classmates. He did not access social media. He did not attempt to retrieve personal belongings. There was no digital trace of planning. No evidence of independence. No sign of continuation. And yet, the narrative presented required her to have left intentionally. That contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore. As the investigation deepened, police widened their lens, not to assign blame prematurely, but to understand control and access. Bernadette was a minor. Her movements were shaped by adults. Her choices existed within boundaries set by others. That imbalance mattered. Because when a young person disappears without preparation, without communication, and without trace, investigators must ask not just where they went, but who controlled the last environment they were seen in. By this stage, Scott Walker was no longer simply a concerned father providing information. He was a central figure whose account needed verification at every point. Police did not arrest him. They did not charge him. They continued collecting data, vehicle logs, phone records, statements revisited again and again. Each pass narrowed the margin for error. Each review tightened the timeline. And slowly, quietly, the investigation moved away from the idea of a runaway and toward something far more deliberate. Because if Bernadette had not left on her own, then her disappearance had not been spontaneous, had been controlled. And whoever controlled it had been with her when she was last seen alive. The question investigators were now facing was no longer whether the story held together. It was how long it could withstand scrutiny. And it was beginning to crack. By the time investigators reached this stage, Bernadette Walker was no longer being treated as a missing teenager who might return. She was being treated as a young woman whose absence required explanation, not hope. The shift was subtle but decisive. It began with time. Hours passed, and Bernadette did not surface anywhere. No sightings, no messages, no evidence of movement beyond what had already been documented. Police began reconstructing the final 48 hours before she vanished. Minute by minute, signal by signal, movement by movement. The timeline started on July 18, 2020. Bernadette was last seen at her grandparents' home in Peterborough. It was a familiar place. Ordinary. Nothing about that evening suggested it would be the last confirmed sighting of her. Later that night, Scott Walker reported that an argument occurred. According to his account, Bernadette became upset. Voices were raised. Emotions escalated. He claimed he decided to drive her away from the house, eventually letting her out near a local park so she could cool off. It was a narrative meant to explain separation without violence. But narratives must survive evidence. Investigators returned to Bernadette's phone data. Her device showed activity consistent with being inside the home, and then suddenly nothing. No outgoing calls, no text, no app usage, no location updates consistent with walking away. The silence was immediate. And silence, in investigations like this, is rarely neutral. If Bernadette had exited the vehicle where Scott Walker claimed, her phone would have continued connecting to nearby towers. There would have been movement, drift, trail. There was none. Next came vehicle evidence. Scott Walker's car became central, not because of assumption but because of opportunity. Automatic number plate recognition systems and CCTV footage across Peterborough recorded the vehicle's movements that night. Investigators mapped each appearance against Scott Walker's statements. The routes did not align. The timings did not match. The vehicle traveled to locations not mentioned. It lingered in areas inconsistent with a simple drop-off. Some movements had no explanation at all. Then there was the issue of distance. If Bernadette had been released near the park, investigators expected potential witnesses, foot traffic, cameras, even incidental sightings. None existed. Searches began. Police, volunteers, and search teams combed wooded areas, paths, waterways, and parks across Peterborough and surrounding regions. Dogs were deployed. Thermal imaging used. Public appeals issued. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of Bernadette. And yet, her phone never reactivated. Her bank account showed no activity. Her social presence vanished completely. This was not disappearance. It was removal. As evidence accumulated, investigators began re-interviewing Scott Walker. Each interview returned to the same points: the argument, the drive, the drop-off. But when details were examined closely, inconsistencies multiplied. Small changes in phrasing, unclear descriptions of locations, memory gaps where precision was required. Not dramatic lies, but erosion. And erosion matters, because truth, when repeated, stays stable. False narratives shift. Police also examined Scott Walker's behavior after Bernadette was reported missing. He participated in appeals. He spoke publicly. But behind the scenes, actions raised concern. Digital activity showed attempts to access Bernadette's accounts. Phone records indicated deletions. Search histories were scrutinized. None of it provided a direct answer, but all of it suggested control. And control was the central theme now emerging. Bernadette had not exercised choice after leaving that house. Someone else had. By late 2020, investigators reached a conclusion, not about where Bernadette was, but about what had happened. They determined she was no longer alive. This conclusion was not announced lightly. It was based on absence, behavior, and evidence, not emotion. No teenager vanishes completely without preparation, resources, or contact. And Bernadette had none of those. Still, there was one devastating reality. Her body had not been found, which meant the case would need to stand without it. That changed everything. Because now, the investigation was no longer about locating Bernadette. It was about proving that her disappearance was deliberate, and identifying who had orchestrated it. The focus narrowed further, and the pressure intensified, because the evidence was pointing in one direction. And that direction led back to the last adult who had control over Bernadette Walker's movements. her father. The question now facing investigators was no longer whether something had happened. It was whether they could prove it, without the one piece of evidence that usually speaks loudest. And that challenge would define everything that came next. When police made the decision to arrest Scott Walker, they did so knowing the case would face its greatest challenge. There was no body. There was no single moment of discovery that would explain everything. There was only a young woman who had vanished completely, and a trail of evidence that led back to one person. Scott Walker was charged with the murder of his daughter, Bernadette Walker. The charge itself marked a profound shift. What had begun as a missing person investigation was now a homicide case built on absence, contradiction, and control. From the outset, prosecutors made their position clear. This case was not about a sudden loss of temper captured on video. It was about a sequence of actions. They argued that Bernadette was killed on the night she disappeared, and that deliberate steps were taken afterward to ensure she would never be found. The trial focused on reconstruction rather than spectacle. Jurors were walked carefully through timelines, phone data, vehicle movements, and inconsistencies. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern. A phone that went silent at a moment inconsistent with the defendant's story. A car traveling routes unexplained by the account given, statements that shifted as facts emerged. Prosecutors emphasized that Bernadette had left behind everything she cared about. Her phone, her plans, her future. They argued that a teenager does not simply disappear without preparation, and that Bernadette had shown none. The defense highlighted what was missing. No body, no murder weapon, no eyewitness. They urged jurors to consider doubt. But the court reminded them of something critical. Circumstantial evidence is still evidence, and absence, when deliberate, speaks. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Scott Walker was found guilty of murder. The decision carried weight far beyond the courtroom. Bernadette's body had never been recovered. Yet the court concluded that the evidence left no reasonable alternative explanation for her disappearance. Scott Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment. For Bernadette's family, the verdict delivered accountability, but not closure. There would be no recovery, no place to mourn, no final answer to where her remains were hidden. Only the certainty that she had been taken, and that the person responsible had been named. In the years since, Bernadette Walker's case has stood as one of the most significant no-body murder convictions in the United Kingdom. It underscored how modern investigations rely not only on physical recovery, but on digital footprints, behavioral analysis, and pattern recognition. It also forced a difficult conversation about vulnerability within families, about how control can exist quietly, and how warning signs are often visible only in hindsight. Bernadette was 17 years old. She was a student, photographer, a young woman still forming her identity, her voice, her future. She deserved time. She deserved safety. She deserved to be believed. Her case remains a reminder that disappearance is not the absence of a story, but often the presence of one carefully hidden, and that even when silence is enforced, truth has a way of surfacing. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We post crime case videos nightly. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.